Today I'm making a short recording on evolution and natural selection. The topics that I covered during this class were evolution by natural selection. I skipped over a lot of the slides about how Darwin came up with the process of natural selection. And I'm also going to talk about an example of evolution that we can see today. So evolution by natural selection is a process that helps us understand why there is so much diversity in living organisms. Evolution has led to that diversity, but it also explains similarities between all living things. So this is what we call a phylogenetic tree. Now, when Darwin was first developing his ideas about evolution, he called it descent with modification. And that is the process that leads to the formation of new species. So let me explain how this works by looking at this phylogenetic tree. 60 million years ago, there was an ancestral carnivore. So a carnivore is an organism, an animal that eats other organisms. So we had the ancestral carnivore, and over many, many millions of years, a variety of carnivores evolved. So you can see here, we go from having one type of carnivore to having 7. Now, a process like this, descent with modification, like I said, takes many millions of years. But this is how new species are formed. Now, the other interesting thing about evolution is it explains what we call unity in life. There are similarities between all living organisms. For example, when the first cell evolved on Earth, it developed DNA in order to transmit genes from one generation to the next. In the case of the cell, it was reproducing asexually, right? But DNA is the molecule that carries our genetic information. And DNA is present in all living organisms, because it was present in the original cell from which all life evolved. DNA works so well as a way to pass on genetic information that it's just never changed throughout all of this time. So evolution can explain diversity, but also similarities. I'm going to skip this slide and come back to it in just a few minutes. So evolution. There are actually 2 types of evolution. There's descent with modification. We also call that macroevolution. And that is the formation of species, like I just showed you. So macroevolution is the formation of new species from a common ancestor. Macro means like large scale. But what we're going to talk about today is microevolution. Microevolution occurs within a population of organisms. So it is the change in the frequency or percentage of individuals with a certain gene version over many generations. And I'm going to explain what this means. So microevolution is the change in the frequency or percentage of individuals that have a certain gene version, and this change occurs over many generations. So what do I mean by version of a gene? So let's take a look at the picture. Here we have mice. Some of our mice are brown, some are gray. Now, this represents a population of the same type of mouse. So I want to remind you of the definition of a population at this point. A population is a group of the same type of organism. We're going to call that a species, living in the same area. A group of the same type of organism or species living in the same area. So this would be a population of a certain type of mouse, let's say in a field. So if you look at the first generation, right here, there are 50% gray mice and 50% brown mice in that population. So 50% of your individuals are gray, 50% are brown. Now, let's say a fox is able to easily catch those gray mice. Perhaps they don't blend into their environment very well. They're not camouflaged. So the wolf is going to eat those gray mice because it's easier, right? So the gray mice are being eaten, so they do not have the chance to reproduce. But the brown mice do have the chance to reproduce. They make brown mice babies. So the next generation, you have more brown mice because the ones from the previous generation reproduced, passed on their gene, and their babies are brown. But there's only a few gray mice because they were not able to reproduce as much. Most of them were eaten, a few were not. So then we have the fox is going to eat those remaining gray mice. So the third generation, the brown mice made offspring, but the gray mice are gone. So when I say a change in the percentage of individuals for a given gene, this is what I mean. So let me try to summarize this for you. So in the first generation, there are 50% brown mice and 50% gray mice. Okay, 50% of your individuals are brown, 50% gray. Keep in mind, they're the same kind of mouse. They're not different types of mice. So now your second generation, actually, I'm going to skip to my third generation. It's 100% brown mice. So microevolution has occurred. You went from 50% brown mice to 100% brown mice. So the gene that we're looking at is coat color. And there are two versions of that gene, one for brown and one for gray. So gene is coat color. One version of the gene codes for brown hair and one for gray hair. So what's changing here in the population is the percentage of mice that have that version for brown or gray hair. And like I said, that is microevolution. You are changing the percentage of individuals with a certain gene version over many generations. So let's go back and look at this slide. This is basically demonstrating the same process. I want to take a step back here, though, and mention that there are different processes that lead to evolution. But natural selection is the only process that results in adaptations, right? An individual having certain traits that allow it to survive in a given habitat. So an adaptation is a trait that allows an individual to survive in a given environment. So natural selection is the only way that adaptations arise. Now, there are several requirements for natural selection to occur. So first of all, there has to be variation in a trait. So here we're looking at wing color for butterflies. So the trait is wing color. There's variation because some of the butterflies in the population have yellow wings and some have brown. So the gene is wing color. Variation means some butterflies are yellow and some are brown. Okay, so variation in a population. If all the butterflies look the same, then they all have an equal chance of being eaten. Right? For natural selection to occur, some of the individuals have to be better at surviving. So let me repeat that. For natural selection to occur, some of the individuals have to be better at surviving than others. Another quality in the population that has to exist for natural selection is competition. Most organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. Now, I think this even applies to humans. But most organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. That means there will be competition for survival. Now, in this particular slide, they put adaptations as number 3. I don't really call that a requirement for natural selection. That's what natural selection leads to, is individuals being well adapted to their environment. And I'm going to expand on this in just a minute. Finally, for natural selection to occur, number 4 says selection. But what that really means is there has to be an agent of selection, like a predator or a food shortage. So there must be an agent of selection. Okay, something that is killing off the individuals that are not as well adapted. Now, here I have listed the requirements for natural selection. So I want to remind you that natural selection is the only process by which adaptations occur. So before I go over these requirements again, I want to give you a little more insight into natural selection. So first of all variation in individuals, doesn't matter what kind of organism you're looking at, but all variation in individuals arises randomly. Actually, I'm going to say arises from random genetic mutations. All variation in individuals arises from random genetic mutations. What that means is variation is random, but natural selection is not. So with natural selection, the individuals that are better suited for their environment will leave more offspring, passing on their genes to the next generation. Now, you have all probably heard of survival of the fittest, and that's how a lot of people refer to natural selection. This is a little misleading because when I say fitness, what it really refers to is the number of offspring an individual produces. So fitness refers to the number of offspring an individual produces. The number of offspring an individual produces. Because those individuals that are better suited to their environment, they have like awesome genes, gene versions for their environment, and they're passing that on to future generations. Whereas if an individual is not well suited to its environment, it dies before it reproduces very much. So its genes are not passed on. Finally, I want to emphasize that evolution and adaptation occur within a population, within or to a population. But natural selection acts on an individual. So an individual cannot change their traits over their lifetime. You cannot say that, say the brown mice have adapted to their environment necessarily, right? Like a mouse isn't born gray. It looks around and says, oh man, I don't blend very well. I want to be brown. And then it turns brown. That doesn't happen, right? But those individual gray mice are going to be eaten by the fox, which is the agent of selection. So the fox is eating the individual mice that are not well suited to their environment. That's natural selection. But over many, many generations, that population of mice are going to go from from brown and gray to all brown. That is evolution. It occurs to the population. So let's look at these requirements for natural selection one more time. Individuals have to vary in their characteristics, and that comes about through random genetic mutation. Another requirement is organisms produce more offspring than can actually survive in their environment. So I always think of like rabbits, they reproduce a lot. They can have a litter like every 30 days. So if you're picturing like a meadow, there will be so many rabbits that there's not enough food available. So the rabbits that are best at getting food will be the ones to survive. The rabbits that are not, do not have traits that allow them to, I don't know, find food very easily, they'll die off. Now, another characteristic I hadn't mentioned yet is that whatever trait you're looking at, coat color, whatever, it has to be heritable. It has to be passed from parent to offspring. And then finally, there has to be a selective agent. Now that can be predation, like the fox or a bird. It could also be lack of shelter or lack of resources. Let's see, lack of resources, predation, anything that is allowing some of the organisms to survive while others do not survive. So here is just another illustration to help you with natural selection. So here is a population of beetles. We have brown beetles and green beetles. Now keep in mind, these are all the same kind of beetle. And let's say this is a grassy area. You have all these green beetles that blend in. And once in a while, a brown beetle is produced. There's a genetic mutation and the beetle is brown instead of green. Now, let's say a drought happened. All the grass dies away. Now it's more shrubby with a lot of dirt. Now those green beetles don't blend very well. The brown beetles blend. So here is our agent of selection, a bird. It's eating those green beetles because they do not blend. Now notice in our population, there are very few brown beetles, but then we have many generations later, there's more brown beetles and fewer green because those brown beetles from the previous generation, they were more successful. They blended better. They made more offspring and passed on that brown gene to their offspring. But the green beetles are getting eaten. A few of them can reproduce, but not that many. So you see, brown beetles are becoming more abundant. Finally, many, many generations later, the green beetles have been eaten. There are no more green beetles in the population. Now it's 100% brown. So it is a change in the percentage of individuals with a given gene version for whatever it is you're looking at, whatever trait, right, over many, many generations. So let me write that down for you again. I know I already wrote this down, but this will just give you some repetition. So it's a change in the percentage of individuals with a given gene version. Remember, we're looking at brown versus green color. So it's a change in the percentage of individuals with a given gene over many generations. This doesn't happen immediately, right? It takes several generations, depending on what you're looking at, in order to see this change in the percentage of individuals with a given trait. This is what I wrote before. Fitness refers only to the number of offspring an individual produces, because they're passing on those good genes to their offspring. That way, the good version of the gene becomes more abundant in the population. And adaptation is a trait that increases the probability that an individual will survive and make offspring. Now we're going to skip these slides on Darwin until here. So Darwin sailed around the world on the Beagle, right? This was in the 1800s. And he collected plants and animals and other organisms to study them on the, on the boat and when he got back home. And yes, he killed them, unfortunately, but that's how people studied nature back then. I still do, I guess. So he ended up in the Galapagos Islands. These are off of the coast of South America. And there's more than one island. It's an archipelago. This is a video just showing you a little bit about the life on the Galapagos Islands. Whoops. Okay, hold on one second. I'm having some issues here. Wait, there it is. You should be able to see my PowerPoint. Hopefully that's what you're on. Now, what you're looking at here is a finch, a type of bird. And what really clued Darwin in to the whole process of natural selection was looking at the different types of finches on the islands, for the Galapagos archipelago. So there was an original finch that he saw on the coast of South America. And this finch made it over to the islands. Once it was on these islands, it evolved. It adapted to its environment. So now there's all different kinds of finches on the Galapagos Islands. And what's mainly different between these birds is their beak. So the finch dispersed to the islands, and then depending on food availability, the populations changed. So like here's the large ground finch and the medium ground finch. These right here, these are, it says crushing bills, they're seed eaters. And then we have the finches with the probing bills, and then those that live in the trees and eat insects and fruit. So if you had this original finch, eventually a genetic mutation would have occurred that changed its beak shape. And if that finch with the mutation was better able to get food, it makes more offspring. And eventually the population will be full of finches with large beaks. Now, the last part I want to go over is an example of evolution today. So in Florida, there is a bug called the soapberry bug. Looks similar to some bugs you might see here. So the soapberry bug has a really long proboscis or feeding tube. It inserts it into the fruit of the balloon vine, and it has to insert it down to where the seeds are so that it can eat. So in southern Florida, there's a lot of balloon vine. It's a native species, it belongs there. And so researchers had measured what they call beak size of the soapberry bug there. Now in central Florida, the balloon vine has mostly died off and been replaced by this golden rain tree. And the seeds in the golden rain tree are much closer to the surface of the fruit. So what researchers found is here is the average beak size for soapberry bugs on a balloon vine. But here, right about here, is average beak size of soapberry bugs on the golden rain tree. It's a lot lower because they don't need that really long beak to get to the seeds. So over generations, soapberry bugs with a shorter beak were more successful, made more babies. And now the whole population of soapberry bugs have shorter beaks on average. So this is evolution today. You can also see evolution if you think about antibiotic resistance in bacteria. We develop new antibiotics, bacteria eventually become resistant to that antibiotic, and they pass on this resistance. It's in their DNA, and they pass it on to other bacteria. So those other bacteria are then resistant to the antibiotic. That is evolution. You are changing the percentage of bacteria in a population that are resistant to antibiotics. Starts out small, then most of the bacteria are resistant. So you're changing that percentage of individuals over generations. And that is the end of this presentation.